Chapter 20. I saw the church class structure in Chapter 17. Now I learn about the church power classes, which is where money, influence, and politics come into play. My relatives and I gained power in the church, and there was an eventual clash when the pastor became jealous. The power classes set the dynamic for why this clash happened. It took years to prove my loyalty to the church and pastor, but eventually I rose to the top of the on-fire church class. From there were a few paths to power. Some members would first prove themselves by becoming teachers, while others went to Bible college. Another option was to become a standalone preacher in gospel missions, or on the street corner. Soon after joining the church, a visiting speaker prophesied that a relative should become a preacher, and he started weeks later. This set him and those close to him apart, and pastors took notice. He was now in the lowest church power class, and had authority when he spoke. This was the same relative that staged my intervention in Chapter 6. Church power. When standalone preachers had enough experience, they could bring new life requirements to the church through their messages. A successful preacher might become a pastor by starting a new church, or subcongregation, while remaining under the original pastor's oversight. Pastors of pastors are higher in the power classes. One service, the pastor's pastor visited to check in. He privately told our pastor to put more care into his preaching, and spend more time studying. At the time, we all brushed it off since we thought service was good, but the advice was accurate. Things had begun to decline, and that would soon come to light. As pastors gained power, so did their preachers. Through popularity and reputation, preachers became influential. They might be invited to speak at other churches' events, if their pastor allowed it. If preachers are popular enough, pastors can be pressured to agree with their messages. The highest level of pastoral authority belonged to mega church pastors. They would speak at events, and were inaccessible to lower classes. However, the real power was behind the scenes. The highest power classes were the area and organizational leaderships, which had control over church pastors. They could direct pastors to shut down their preachers, or replace the pastor altogether. The leadership removed the previous pastor, because the congregation shrank over time. Our pastor had recurring leadership meetings to make the case for why he should stay pastor. The only challenge to the leadership's power was the highly influential preacher class. These were preachers who ascended to speaking on the world stage at the largest events. We drove hundreds of miles to hear our favorite preachers, and would have immediately joined their church if they started one. A small number of highly influential preachers spoke out against the leadership, while preaching at large events. They said the leadership tried to stop them from preaching things that didn't fit their agenda. These speakers preached anyway, saying they would do what God wanted even if they weren't invited back. One of those preachers was pushed out of the organization soon after. Pastors had more to lose than preachers and almost never spoke against the leadership. They could be easily removed, which reinforced conformance. If a pastor fought back and attempted to take his church out of the organization, he was labeled as an enemy of God. This scared many members into keeping their distance and prompted others to try to win back the individuals. Politics and cash flow. More members meant more money. Each member gave 10% of their wages to the pastor, and roughly 5% to the church. Each pastor did the same to the pastors over him, and so on, up to the leadership in a pyramid fashion. Threats to a pastor's power came from both outside and inside the church. Poaching threat. Poaching was when members switched to another church without moving residences. It was looked down upon, especially if the members crossed jurisdiction lines. If there was a local church that might be more appealing than the pastor's church, he could indirectly criticize it. Then members would use that to directly criticize and keep other members from switching. While switching between local churches was frowned upon, the cash flow of moving over state lines, for example, affects multiple levels of leadership. When my relatives and I switched to the second church, our commute crossed state lines, and the area leadership got directly involved in both churches. We ultimately got the okay to switch, but were given stern warnings that going back and forth, also known as church hopping, was unacceptable if we wanted to stay in the organization. Preacher threat. Just as the highly influential preachers spoke out against the leadership, a church preacher could bring ideas to the church that weren't approved by the pastor. While the pastor could easily override the message in a number of ways, preachers had informal followings. This meant that a popular preacher could rival the pastor's popularity, which also meant correcting the preacher could divide members away from the pastor. Some pastors controlled the messages of the preachers by giving them their topic and conclusion. However, standalone preachers were used to coming up with messages on their own, and weren't as malleable as a teacher or Bible college grad. Further, preachers could have sub-congregations and attend both churches, making control even more difficult. One technique to shut preachers down was to crowd them out. More obedient members would be scheduled in advance, so there were no speaking opportunities for the first preacher. However, it could backfire if he had a large following. Members might grow restless if their favorite preacher was blocked and start requesting that he be brought back. Losing control of a preacher that didn't line up with all the pastor's ideas could mean a church split, which results in a large reduction of cash flow and possible removal by the leadership. Next, jealousy drives the pastor to make a power grab and begin committing crimes.